Welcome to 5 Good Minutes.
You're listening to today's inspirational message
On the book of Romans with Kurt Bjorklund.
Romans 7, chapter 7, verse 14, through the end of the chapter, is actually a passage that's fairly heavily debated. And it's debated mostly because there are different views about who Paul is describing himself to be when he says that he, in essence, does the things he doesn't want to do. And I want to just go over three primary views here, and I'm taking most of this material from James Montgomery Boyce. Here's what is one view, and that is that the person or the man of Romans 7 is unsaved. In this view, the person in Romans 7 is somebody who has not yet come to faith, and so the battle is one that is between his flesh and the desire to do right, and the reason that he's a slave to sin is troublesome for people who want to see this as somebody who's quote-unquote saved, and therefore they say this cannot be true of somebody who is a regenerate person. And when Paul says nothing good lives in him in verse 18, he qualifies it by saying that this is my sinful nature. But even so, can a believer really speak in these terms, knowing that God indwells the believer? And a little later in verse 24, he says, "What a wretched man that I am. Who will rescue me from this body of death?" And again, the argument would be, doesn't he know that he's already been rescued by Christ? But here are a few reasons why I think this view doesn't hold up. And that is what Paul says of himself in Romans 7, 14 through 24, is not what Paul says of his pre-Christian state in other passages. Again, this is from James Montgomery Boyce. He says this: Paul is distressed over his inability to fulfill the law's just demands. He is wretched as a result of his failure. He is calling out for deliverance by someone outside himself. But what unbeliever ever thinks like that? What Paul thought of himself before his conversion is summarized in Philippians 3, where he claims that he had been faultless as far as legalistic righteousness is concerned, Philippians 3:6. The unbeliever is not distressed by his failure to keep God's law. On the contrary, he's satisfied with his performance. Here's a second reason. Paul delights in God's law, and it's expressed in a passage which cannot be found in unbelievers. Again, verse 16 and 22 of Romans 7. And then the present tense is used throughout the second half of Romans 7. And this is an apparently meaningful contrast to the past tense employed earlier. J.I. Packer says it this way: Paul's shift from the past tense to the present in verse 14 has no natural explanation, save that he now moves from talking about his experience with God's law in his pre-Christian days to talking about his experience as it was at the time of the writing. And so what is at stake here is just this idea that this can't possibly be a Christian, because if it's a Christian, then you're too defeated by sin. And it holds out this idea of maybe Christian perfectionism that says once you're in Christ that you can overcome sin. And people who argue that this is talking about the unsaved would actually push back and say, but this is just too full of defeated language when Paul says, hey, I do what I don't want to do. And so I end up in this place. But I would argue that this is a Christian who this is talking about, not somebody who is unsaved. And again, may seem like an academic debate, but it really matters when it comes to interpreting this particular passage. And so today, let me just ask you, is it easier for you to think of yourself as being beyond sin or yourself as still struggling with sin? And what is the harm of saying, I might still have a struggle with sin, but God has called me to something more?
Thanks for joining us here today. There's a lot of great content to explore on Orchard Hill Plus and on the Orchard Hill main feed from the weekend. Have a great day.